I've been talking and predicting.
Welcome back to the second part of the legendary Ali saga. In this video, we take you through the epic tale of Ali's terrifying pro debut.
Because I am the king. I understand you have a queen of England, but you don't have a king.
Brutal training, unnerving prophecies,
If you like to lose your money, be a fool and bet on Sunday.
and rise as a contender for a piece of the World Heavyweight Championship. Last episode, we saw Clay enter the world of boxing after a rough childhood and aspire to become the best. He'd managed to claw his way through and finally snagged the gold in the Olympics, but now it was time for his real challenge. So, without further ado, let's get into the video.
And I'm ready to go.
Turning pro. After winning the gold medal at the 1960 Olympics in Rome, Cassius Clay returned home triumphant to the United States, stopping first in New York. There, the 18-year-old light heavyweight from Louisville toured the town for the next 48 hours. He stayed at the Waldorf Astoria, hit up Times Square, tried his first slice of cheesecake, and visited Birdland, the famed jazz club on Broadway. Though he was legally able to drink by then, he had no interest in doing so. Still, he wanted to celebrate his Olympic win in style, so he ordered a Coke and put 1 drop of whiskey in it, he told the bartender. That may very well have been the only drop of alcohol Clay, who became Muhammad Ali when he converted to Islam in 1964, would ever try in his 74 years on Earth. He lived a remarkably healthy lifestyle, nor eating pork. He didn't enjoy soda, and he most certainly eschewed alcohol, which makes it all the more amazing that Ali's professional boxing career, launched in the first few months after his return from Rome, would be in large part funded thanks to a Kentucky whiskey distillery, which remains an indelible part of his legacy, even today. The next step for Ali was to become a professional boxer.
Have your boys plan to turn pro? Well, yes, I was thinking about turning pro. For an example, right now I'm the world's amateur light heavyweight champion and I'm broke.
Accordingly, serious courting by those who wanted to be his manager soon began. One of the most important decisions that every fighter has to make is whom to choose as the person or organization that will represent him in the business of boxing. The manager's role is crucial because he's the person who books opponents, chooses venues, and negotiates contracts with clubs and coliseums, as well as radio and television networks. For making the decisions that guide a fighter's career, the manager receives a portion of the boxer's fee for a fight. Under the best of circumstances, the manager consults with the boxer about these decisions so that there's an agreement between them. But many managers have tried to trick or bully a fighter, especially a young fighter, into signing unfair contracts or making other exploitative arrangements. In the 1940s and 1950s, much of the fight business fell under the influence of organized crime.
People once called New York Fun City. Now the police and firemen's unions in New York are calling it Fear City.
During that time, it wasn't unusual for a manager to demand that a fighter deliberately lose a match so that the racketeers could win large amounts of money by betting against the fighter. This type of match was known as a fixed fight, and it was only one of many ways that a manager who had made some sort of an arrangement with the criminal element could exploit a boxer. Because Clay was well aware of the pitfalls one could encounter when choosing a manager, he proceeded cautiously with his decision.
Any ideas now as to whom you might sign with?
Well, yes, it's best to be with somebody you know and from your own town if possible. Nice, honest crowd, nice, clean people, and with the right backing, I believe I have a nice chance to become the world's heavyweight champion.
In the spring and summer before his Olympic victory, a wealthy Louisville businessman approached Clay through Martin. This businessman, William Reynolds, was an heir to the Reynolds aluminium fortune. He'd heard that Clay was a major contender for the Olympic gold medal, and he was interested in backing Clay by becoming his manager once he became a professional fighter. Because Reynolds was already rich, it's probable that his interest in Clay had as much to do with the prestige of backing a champion fighter as it did with accumulating more money. Reynolds sought to entice Clay by employing him as a laborer around his luxurious Louisville home. He also bought Clay new equipment and promised him a large contract if he won the gold medal. Yet, Reynolds never gave Clay the feeling that he cared for him as a person. It seemed to Clay that Reynolds wanted to own him as though he were a piece of property, and this wasn't the kind of relationship that the young fighter wanted. He was too aware of his people's history of slavery to allow any manager to feel as though he owned him. Immediately after Clay won the gold medal in Rome, Reynolds lavished attention on the new champion. On Clay's way back to Louisville from Italy, Reynolds let him stay free of charge for a week at his suite in New York City's luxurious Waldorf Astoria hotel. He provided Clay with money to buy expensive presents for his parents, and he provided him with pocket money to spend around town. One of the first things that Clay did with Reynolds' money was to look up Sugar Ray Robinson, who had recently retired from the ring and was running a nightclub in Harlem. The former welterweight and middleweight champion had been one of Clay's heroes for some time. The young champion introduced himself to the old pro and then asked him to be his manager. Robinson, apparently content with his life and only dimly aware of who Clay was, turned down the young Olympian's offer. Shortly after this encounter, Clay returned home to a hero's welcome in Louisville. He was feted and saluted by the governor of Kentucky as well as by both the mayor and the police chief of Louisville. He was even given a parade down the main street of his hometown, but when he went to eat at a restaurant, he was refused service because he was black.
A cup of coffee, hot dog. Lady said, "We don't serve Negroes." I was so mad. I said, "I don't eat them either. Just give me a couple of hamburgers."
He subsequently threw his Olympic gold medal into the Ohio River in disgust at the country he'd represented at the Olympic Games. Before long, Reynolds sent over his contract offer to manage Clay. So did former boxing champions Archie Moore and Rocky Marciano, the well-respected manager Gus D'Amato, and a group of 10 Louisville businessmen who called themselves the Louisville Millionaires. Clay and his father, with the assistance of a trusted family attorney, looked over all of the offers carefully. The two best offers were from Reynolds and the Louisville Millionaires. There was scarcely any difference between the two contracts, but Clay had little difficulty in deciding which one to accept. He informed an angry Martin that he was turning down Reynolds' offer. This rejection ended Clay's relationship not only with Reynolds, but with Martin, too. The Louisville Millionaires were headed by Bill Faversham, the son of an English actor.
So I got a hold of a black man, I guess is the word I have to use now, who worked for me. Very bright young fellow. And I said, "You know Cassius by any chance?" And he said, "Yes, he did." And I said, "Well, I'd like you, George, to arrange a meeting between Cassius and me."
A former leading man on Broadway, Bill Faversham Jr. eventually gave up on that racket and by the end of World War II found himself living in Louisville. There, he got a job at Brown-Forman, then known for producing Jack Daniels, Old Forester, and Early Times whiskies. By 1960, Faversham had risen to vice president in charge of sales in 18 states. He was a Kentucky bigwig, but not the biggest wig in town by any stretch of the imagination. A longtime fan of the sweet science he'd worked out in the late 1920s by sparring with fellow actor Spencer Tracy, he, like many others, was well aware of his city's local boxing sensation ever since Clay had won the prestigious amateur boxing title, the Golden Gloves, in 1959. After Clay returned from his exploits in Rome, Faversham noticed the boxer had been unable to come to an arrangement with a sponsor. With plans to go pro, Clay would need money to support him while he trained for his first fights. Faversham figured it would cost around $20,000, about $190,000 today, to fund the boxer before he'd start winning purses that would begin paying dividends to his benefactors. Faversham's boss at the distillery certainly had the money for such a gamble. William Lee Lyons Brown was then chairman of the board at Brown-Forman, his family's business, and a foghorn leghorn-like caricature of a Southern gentleman. He too was a boxing fan, having fought for the U.S. Naval Academy team during his time in Annapolis. These two whiskey execs would form the basis for what they called the Louisville Sponsoring Group, LSG, bringing aboard 9 other Louisville locals. The group featured captains of industry spanning from tobacco and horse breeding to newspaper publishing and liquor wholesaling, as done by syndicate member Vert Smith, who sold a reported $4.5 million of booze per year. In this still segregated city, most were also members of the esteemed and then whites-only Penn Dennis Club, the private social club that continues to stand by its apocryphal claim that the old-fashioned cocktail was invented there. Each man contributed $2,800 to the sponsorship fund, with Faversham getting a free half share for organizing things. This was merely an amusement, a minor investment, a lark for these wealthy men. Still, they wanted Clay on board. The Clay family had already turned down one sponsorship group and had hired a local lawyer, Alberta Jones, who took them to a meeting with Faversham. He offered Clay a $10,000 signing bonus plus a guaranteed annual salary of $4,800, as well as covering all of his expenses, not to mention offering him the group's business insights. This was considered rare in an era when boxers like Sonny Liston were mostly funded by the mafia, who would often fleece them, or worse. Their contract with Clay ran for 6 years, from 1960 to 1966. They were to receive 50% of his earnings, both in and out of the ring, for the duration of their agreement. At the time, Clay felt lucky to have negotiated such a deal. He used the advance to pay off the mortgage of his parents' house and to repair its leaks and sagging porch. He also had the comfort of knowing that his managers were honest. They'd stick to the agreement that the two parties had made. They would never ask him to deliberately lose a fight, and they would schedule him fairly, asking him to fight against equal and worthy opponents. Becoming a contender. Next, Clay had to select the best trainer that he could find. Stoner had been a fine trainer for Clay when he was still an amateur, but he didn't have the ring experience that the fighter needed now that Clay had become a professional. The Louisville group knew that Archie Moore ran a boxing camp in the hills above San Diego in Southern California. Moore had the experience that Clay was looking for. He'd been actively involved in boxing since 1938 and had won the light heavyweight championship in 1952, keeping the title for 10 years. By 1960, Moore was 47 years old and nearing the end of his boxing career, but he agreed to become Clay's trainer. Moore's camp was in the country because he liked to isolate his fighters from distractions and temptations. He also felt that it was best to bring Clay along slowly toward the championship. Consequently, the young fighter wasn't allowed to spar with Moore himself until weeks after he'd reported to the camp. Clay bridled at Moore's slow pace. He felt that he was ready to begin his climb to the top of the boxing world right away, and he pushed for a sparring season with the older fighter. Sparring is when two boxers get into the ring to fight a practice round. Sparring rounds are usually 3 minutes long, the same length as a round in a regular boxing match. If a boxer wants to increase his stamina, he'll spar for longer periods, sometimes up to 7 or 8 minutes a round. Clay finally succeeded in getting Moore into the ring with him, and the two fighters sparred for several rounds. Clay punched Moore all over the ring. He hit him with hooks, crosses, and uppercuts, and generally took out his frustrations on Moore. After these rounds, Clay knew that he needed another trainer. Seeing how easily he handled the current light heavyweight champion, even if he was no longer in his prime, convinced Clay that he was indeed ready to move ahead at a faster pace than Moore had suggested. During the time that Clay spent in Moore's camp, he also learned that he could not train in isolation. He said, "I decided that if I was going to be a fighter, I'd have to train around people. I'd have to be around women and children, near barbershops, see people getting their shoes shined, watch the traffic, watch people go in and out of stores, hear them talk and talk back to them. And above all, I wanted to be associated with the instructor who would use his instructions on someone else, not me. I'd gone far past the training period. I wanted to fight, only to fight." A full-blown heavyweight, Clay had indisputably become a dinosaur. After leaving Moore's camp, Clay hooked up with a well-known trainer named Angelo Dundee, who had trained such top fighters as Carmen Basilio, Louis Rodriguez, and Willie Pastrano. Dundee knew how good Clay was, and he quickly agreed to take on the young contender. The trainer said of Clay, "He was always the first in and the last out of the gym." With Dundee serving as his sounding board, Clay threw himself into the grinding tour of boxing that's typical of a hustling young professional. His first professional bout took place in Louisville on October 29, 1960. The result was a 6-round decision over Tony Hunsaker. Clay fought 8 bouts in 1961 and 6 in 1962, averaging a fight every 7 weeks. He won all 14 of these fights, 12 of them by knockouts. In 1962, he also appeared in a minor role in the film version of Rod Setting's play Requiem for a Heavyweight. One of the most interesting fights during this period in Clay's career was his match with Moore, his former trainer, in November 1962. Because they'd once had a sparring session, the fight was, in a sense, a rematch. It was also Clay's first public match with a major fighter. The fight was televised, and Clay's share, $45,000, was at the time by far his largest purse. Because Clay had so easily dominated Moore 2 years before, when he was still a green young pro, he was confident that he'd win the match. What made the fight even more significant to him was that the reigning heavyweight champion, Charles Sonny Liston, would be in the audience. As was becoming Clay's style, he composed a poem that predicted the outcome of the match. "They'll all fall in the round I call," he maintained, and he said before the Moore fight, "When you come to the fight, don't block the halls and don't block the door, for you may go home after round 4. This fight was held on the older fighter's home ground in Los Angeles, California, and the crowd was wildly partisan. Despite the fans who were screaming some more, "Shut him up," and "Hit him in the mouth," Clay methodically demolished his opponent in 4 rounds, just as he had predicted in his poem. An intriguing encounter occurred in Clay's dressing room after the fight. Amid the laughter and joking of Clay's entourage, Liston walked into the room to meet the new contender. Clay looked at his chief rival, who was known for his ice-cold stare, and proclaimed, "King Liston will stay, only until he meets Cassius Clay. Moore fell in 4, Liston in 8. Liston just glared at Clay. The reigning champion then said, "You go 8 seconds with me, little boy, and I'll give you the title." During Clay's next 3 fights in 1963, he strove to perfect the antics that would make him stand out in the crowded field of heavyweight contenders. While he continued to predict, with his style of poetry, the round in which he'd knock out his opponent, he also performed some new publicity stunts. Traveling outside the United States for the first time as a professional, he went to England to fight the British heavyweight champion Henry Cooper. Before the fight, Clay donned a crown and cape and declared himself the uncrowned king of heavyweights. He also predicted that he'd knock out Cooper in the 5th round. The English fans flocked to see Clay get his comeuppance, only to watch Cooper fall in the 6th round. Clay's campaign to seek recognition for himself worked. The more he bragged, strutted, and spouted his poetry, the more he stirred up the boxing world, and an aroused boxing world always means more money for a boxer. This was one of the main reasons for Clay's theatrics. After the Cooper fight, Jack Nylon, Liston's manager, stopped by Clay's dressing room with the news that Liston had decided to fight Clay. Nylon also said that he had a message to deliver from the champion to Clay. He should drink his orange juice and milkshakes and stay well for the fight. Clay, who had recently married Sonji Roy, shouldn't stay up late worrying about the outcome of the money-making fight because, according to Liston, now your wife can be a rich widow. The match was set for February 25, 1964 in Miami, Florida, and the world would witness something that they'd never seen before. If you enjoyed the video, stick with us as we continue to take you through this legendary tale. The next part features a fight that will be forever remembered, a build-up which is considered one of the best in boxing history, and the whole story will have you glued to the screen.